You'd think building boats would be a calm, contemplative job, just wood, water, and time. But in the ancient world, crafting a raft could be the difference between life and drowning status, and starvation, or even worship and sacrifice. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we drift back to when the first shipwrights weren't engineers. They were gamblers. Their materials were primitive, their tools laughable, and their mistakes usually final. A tangle of logs lashed with vines floating unsteadily down a river, thick with silt and fish bones. A fire crackles on shore. Barefoot builders squat nearby, listening for spirits in the current. These aren't blueprints, they're prayers. Who first thought to trust their weight to such a thing? And what myths floated alongside them? If you're still conscious at this point, feel free to tap, like, and subscribe, purely to confuse the algorithm into thinking you're a maritime archaeologist with insomnia. Has anyone ever dreamed of building a boat while half asleep? I won't judge if that's you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The very first rafts weren't much to look at. Picture a few large logs, usually whatever driftwood the river offered that day, tied together with lengths of vine or strips of animal hide. There were no sails, no rudders, and definitely no polished hulls. These rafts were simple floating platforms, designed not with elegance, but with desperation. You might wedge a few rocks for balance, maybe lash a pole for pushing off from the shore. But mostly, you'd pray it didn't flip when you stepped on. You crouch on one now knees, damp from the morning dew that hasn't burned off. The river moves slowly, but with purpose, and each bend in its path feels like a whispered dare. There are no maps, only guesses and gulls. Behind you, the village fades into the mist. Ahead, the world is rumor and shoreline. These earliest vessels were functional, but just barely. They weren't built for speed or comfort. They were made because people needed to cross water or chase fish or reach that shiny thing glinting on the opposite bank. In places like Mesopotamia, people may have started by simply clinging to logs, but as needs grew, more fish, more trade, more adventure, so did ambition. Curiously, some rafts held more than goods or people. They carried beliefs. In ancient Southeast Asia, river rafts might be launched not to explore, but to appease river gods. A small clay idol might be placed at the front. Offerings of fruit or feathers tied to the side. Some rafts were even sent out unmanned, left to drift as gifts to unseen beings. And when they disappeared, it meant the offering had been accepted. One raft found in a peat bog bore not only signs of burning at its edges, but also tiny turtle carvings in the wood. Scholars still argue whether these represented guardian spirits, or perhaps the belief that turtles taught humans how to float. Either way, the symbolism stuck. You'll see turtles in maritime mythologies from China to the Caribbean. There's also debate about what exactly to call these early inventions. Were they ships' boats, or just floating beds with ambition? Some researchers avoid classification, entirely preferring the term watercraft precursors. Others insist that if it could float and carry two goats, it qualifies as a boat. The line between raft and ship is blurrier than a foggy harbor at dawn. In all cases, these first builders were experimenting not just with materials, but with risk. Imagine launching your raft into a rain-swollen river with only your instincts and the squeaking of wet vines to guide you. One wrong move, and you're tumbling into cold currents, clutching a log that doesn't care whether you live or drown. But if you succeed, if you float, if you return, you're more than a traveler. You're a shipbuilder, maybe even a hero. People gather to hear your tale. Wide-eyed children sit at your feet, and someone might even name their next raft after you, assuming it doesn't sink on launch. So the next time you see a fallen log or a tangle of vines, imagine someone thousands of years ago seeing the same thing and thinking, I bet that'll float. The Nile isn't just a river, it's a long, murmuring artery of ancient life flowing past reed beds, crocodile dens, and boat builders who knew how to turn papyrus into passage. Compared to the rough-hewn rafts of early ages, Egyptian boats were sleeker, longer, and designed for more than survival. They carried Pharaoh's grain and gossip, all gliding with quiet determination beneath a blazing sun. You step onto one now, a narrow craft of bundled reeds and carefully carved wood resting just off a muddy dock. Around you, builders hammer pegs, smear fat into seams, and sing rhythmic chants to keep time. Someone tosses a dried lotus flower onto the deck for luck. In ancient Egypt, the boat was more than a tool, it was a symbol. Life revolved around the Nile, and the river, in turn, demanded respect and ritual. Even the gods traveled by boat. Sun god Ra was believed to cross the sky each day in a solar bark battling night-dwelling serpents by moonlight. When real boats floated down the Nile, they mimicked the divine journey, transporting people between towns, temples, and tombs. Early boats were crafted from papyrus reeds, tied tightly with flax rope. Lightweight and flexible, they could slide through marshes and shallow waters with ease. But as ambitions swelled and cargoes grew heavier, wood became the material of choice. Imported cedar from Lebanon offered strength and a lovely scent, assuming you could afford it. The process of building these vessels was both sacred and sweaty. Workers toiled under the sun, wrapping ropes, shaping planks, and stuffing seams with a bizarre mixture of resin clay and animal fats. Crocodile fat was especially prized for its waterproofing properties, though applying it was a pungent ordeal. Some accounts describe crews wearing scented linen scarves to mask the smell, while others simply learned to live with it. There's something oddly poetic about these boats, narrow and elegant, yet built by hands, roughened from sand and labor. They often bore painted eyes on their prows, meant to help the boat see its way. And though the designs varied across dynasties, one feature remained a rope looped from bow to stern, allowing the boat to be pulled from shore to shore during low water seasons. Some vessels were ceremonial, used only for temple rituals or funerals. Others carried grain shipments bound for Memphis, or blocks of limestone headed to a new pyramid. And of course, there were passenger boats, often rented by wealthier Egyptians for river travel, complete with canopies, cushions, and on occasion, a harpist. But not all Nile boats stayed on the river. There are tantalizing hints that some Egyptian ships ventured into the Red Sea and beyond. Ancient graffiti at the Wadi Hammamat quarry describes boats of the king reaching distant ports for exotic goods. Yet historians debate how often such voyages truly occurred. Were these seafaring trips common or rare experiments surviving records suggest both? One thing is certain, the Nile shaped not just Egypt's geography, but its imagination. To build a boat was to build a future to float literally above the shifting sands of fate. And to be a boat builder was to be trusted with that future one papyrus bundle at a time. Follow the river east, where reeds give way to clay and sun-baked soil, and you'll find yourself in Mesopotamia, land of ziggurats, cuneiform, and barges that smelled like a pothole in July. Here, boats weren't just built, they were baked sealed and sometimes cursed. Mesopotamian shipbuilders faced a unique challenge: how to make something float using almost nothing that wanted to. You crouch beside a half finished barge near the banks of the Euphrates. Reeds lie bundled like giant broomsticks, and a pot of bubbling bitumen simmers nearby, black and sticky as a nightmare. A builder stirs it with a stick, muttering a charm under his breath. The smell hits you first: hot tar, mixed with river mud and distant goat. Unlike Egypt's slender elegance, Mesopotamian vessels were functional rectangles closer to rafts than ships. But they worked. Builders would start with tightly woven mats of reeds, layered thickly and shaped into oval hulls. To keep them watertight, they coated the outside in bitumen natural tar found in local pits. It hardened into a flexible shell that was surprisingly durable, though incredibly fragrant. These boats were the trucks of the ancient world. They hauled grain dates, clay tablets, and passengers down the Tigris and Euphrates. Because the rivers often changed course, boats had to be light enough to haul overland if necessary, yet strong enough to withstand unexpected currents or livestock tantrums. One particular type, the kufa, was shaped like a giant bowl, small enough to be carried by two men, but big enough for a merchant's goods and two anxious goats. Some were even fitted with canopies or awnings, creating the world's first floating kiosks. Bitumen, though essential, was controversial. Some scholars suggest its fumes were mildly intoxicating, leading to headaches, hallucinations, or mystical visions. Others argue it simply stank. Either way, working with it required skill and a strong stomach. Interestingly, many of these boat builders were women. Clay tablets mention female laborers involved in both construction and ferry operations, though records are sparse and conflicting. There's still no scholarly consensus on whether this was common or exceptional, but the presence of women in these roles is one of ancient history's more overlooked footnotes. There are also signs that Mesopotamian shipbuilding influenced other cultures. Persian naval design, especially during the Achaemenid Empire, may owe its roots to these sticky, simple crafts. Some boat shapes and sealing techniques appear across regions, though historians debate whether this indicates direct transmission or parallel innovation. At night, barges would be moored by burying their mooring ropes under heavy stones. There were no docks, just clever tricks. And sometimes, when a boat was damaged or unlucky, it was simply left to rot in the reeds. Archaeologists have found fragments of bitumen-coated wood deep in riverbeds, preserved like ancient toffee. The builders who made these boats weren't lauded as heroes. They weren't even always paid in coin, often just in grain beer or a goat leg. Yet their work kept cities alive, fed, and connected. Without them, the scribes would have had no tablets to write on, and the gods no offerings to receive. So if you ever complain about your commute, remember someone once ferried 10 clay jars, 2 chickens, and a slightly drunk astrologer down a twisting river in a tar-sealed basket and still made it to market on time. The clang of bronze, the smell of brine and sweat, the hum of oars in perfect unison like a heartbeat made of wood and war. Welcome to the Aegean, around 1300 BCE, where shipbuilding met its most fearsome evolution yet. No longer just transport or trade, these vessels were built to raid, defend, and intimidate. In the Mycenaean world, every ship had two purposes: to carry olives and to spill blood. You step into a dockyard carved into rocky shoreline where half-built warships rest on wooden cradles like sleeping beasts. Carpenters carve oar holes with obsidian-edged blades. A foreman mutters about weather, while a younger worker carves a snarling lion into a figurehead, because sometimes fear is a more effective weapon than bronze. These Bronze Age ships were slimmer and faster than their reed-wrapped cousins. Long, narrow hulls enabled quick turns and sudden bursts of speed. The prows were often sharpened to serve as rams, some shaped like boar tusks, others like squid beaks or bird claws. A good strike could crack an enemy vessel in half. At sea, speed was survival. The rowers were the engine, and Mycenaean crews trained with brutal discipline. Picture 50 men on benches' backs, rippling, moving in sync to the beat of a drum or the shout of a boatswain. These weren't slaves or conscripts, they were citizens, sometimes even elite warriors. Each knew that failure to row properly meant sinking or worse, capture. One shipwreck recovered near Pylos held oars made from animal bones, shaped and polished until they gleamed. Scholars remain divided on whether these were ceremonial tools, battlefield spoils, or simply creative recycling. Either way, it's hard to ignore the eerie elegance of rowing into battle with the ribs of a beast. Warships of the Aegean also carried archers, javelin throwers, and boarding parties. Warfare at sea was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. Crews practiced not just rowing, but leaping between ships, mid-battle swords drawn. And yet in quieter seasons, the same vessels carried amphorae of wine and honey, skimming across sapphire waters under gentle sails. Figureheads became a kind of psychological warfare. Some ships featured eyes painted at the prow, designed to intimidate or see dangers ahead. Others bore snake's bulls or stylized monsters with open mouths, as if to consume enemy crews whole. These carvings were often ritually blessed before launch, sometimes with blood animal usually. Probably. Shipyards themselves were sacred places. Offerings to Poseidon, to Athena, or to unnamed sea spirits were buried beneath keels. A coin, a feather, a shard of painted pottery. Archaeologists have found these beneath foundations, small signs of big hopes. Some believe dock workers whispered prayers while hammering just to keep the gods from noticing anything ambitious. Yet even here, amid all this craftsmanship and fear, there was absurdity. One tablet from Knossos refers to a vessel nicknamed Crab Eyes, possibly due to its oddly painted prow. Another tells of a ship that capsized because someone forgot to untie the mooring stone. Scholars still argue over how often these errors occurred and how they were punished. In Mycenaean culture, to build a warship was to conjure a creature, part tool, part myth, part muscle. It required skill, nerve, and a kind of ritual stubbornness. And once launched, there was no turning back. The sea would decide whether your creation swam, fought, or sank in silence. The scent of cedar, the sound of chisels biting into seasoned wood. A dockyard alive with purpose and secrets. In Phoenicia, where the mountains kissed the Mediterranean, shipbuilding was more than a craft. It was an inheritance passed down through whispers and muscle memory. From the cities of Tyre and Sidon came ships that would teach the ancient world to sail. You find yourself beneath the canopy of a sun-washed workshop, surrounded by planks as smooth as skin and tools as old as myth. A master shipwright carves an elegant curve into a hull, while a young apprentice carries a jar of purple-stained water to bless the timber. There are no blueprints, only hands that remember. Phoenician ships were famous across the Mediterranean. Sleek, sturdy, and deceptively fast, they were the first to resemble the tall, rigged vessels of later centuries. The hulls were made of Lebanese cedar, a fragrant, rot-resistant wood considered sacred in local lore. Carved with precision, the ships were then bound with wooden pegs and hemp rope, forming a hull that flexed rather than cracked in rough waters. These ships weren't just for trade, they were the trade. Phoenicians transported tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, and their signature purple dye from sea snails crushed by the thousands. That dye, worth more than its weight in gold, gave rise to entire fleets. A single merchant vessel might carry enough to fund a temple or a war. To protect their knowledge, shipwrights worked in secrecy. Designs were passed orally tools, hidden at day's end, and outsiders kept at a distance. Some believe the curved bows and rising sterns of Phoenician ships gave rise to the triremes of Greece and Rome. Others suggest independent evolution. Scholars still debate whether the similarities indicate influence or coincidence. One thing they don't dispute: these ships could sail far, maybe even farther than most people think. There's an old legend, still hotly contested, that Phoenician sailors crossed the Atlantic. Herodotus mentions a voyage around Africa, sponsored by an Egyptian pharaoh. Some modern researchers have even theorized contact with the Americas, citing fragments of Phoenician-style anchors found off unexpected coasts. The evidence is murky, the idea irresistible. Even without transoceanic claims, Phoenician voyages were astonishing in scope. They founded colonies from Cyprus to Carthage, spreading their script, their gods, and their ship designs across 3 continents. Every harbor bore some trace of their work. And yet their shipyards left little behind. No treatises, no manuals. Just tools, timbers, and the echo of hammers against cedar. Superstition ran deep. Before launching, builders would sometimes whisper to the ship, naming it in private, binding it to a spirit, or sealing a vow inside the keel. Some painted tiny fish near the waterline, believed to trick sea monsters into thinking the vessel was one of their own. Perhaps that's why Phoenician ships survived, where others sank, not just craftsmanship, but careful negotiation with the unknown. And if you listen closely here, among the cedar shavings and sea mist, you can almost hear it, the whisper of sails catching wind, and the memory of a civilization that trusted the ocean like an old friend, but never turned its back on it. Some boats are made of wood, some of willpower. The Greek trireme was both. Built like a blade and rowed like a beast, it didn't float so much as slice through the sea. And behind every razor-edged hull was an army not of warriors, but of sweaty, olive-oiled rowers who trained like Olympic athletes and probably smelled worse. Step into a Greek shipyard near Piraeus. The air tastes of sawdust and sea salt. Hammers ring against bronze rivets. A philosopher argues with a carpenter about plank curvature. Nearby, a gang of youths pours oil over their arms and shoulders, laughing before another punishing rowing drill. This isn't leisure. This is war prep. The trireme was Athens' pride and terror. Named for its 3 stacked rows of oars on each side, the design allowed for breathtaking speed and agility so long as the crew could keep pace. That meant synchronized rowing hour after hour, often in brutal heat. The oars were long, the benches cramped, and the discipline severe. No chatting, no slouching, just rhythm and blisters. To build such a ship required engineering genius. The hulls were lightweight but strong, using overlapping planks secured by mortise and tenon joints. Keels were carefully shaped for balance, and sails used only outside battle were secondary to the human engine below deck. It was the ultimate ancient rowing machine. War triremes carried not only marines and archers, but also a formidable bronze ram affixed to the prow. Some of these rams were forged to resemble squid beaks or serpent mouths. With enough speed, they could pierce an enemy hull like an arrow through parchment. One recovered specimen weighs nearly half a ton, yet fits in the palm when sketched on papyrus. Training was relentless. Crews drilled on land and sea, rowing in unison to shouted commands or rhythmic flute music. Missteps weren't just embarrassing, they endangered the entire ship. Ancient authors describe exhausted men collapsing, vomiting, even passing out mid-row. And still, they were expected to rise and row again. Historians still argue whether the human cost of this training was justified by naval dominance or simply another case of state-sponsored masochism. Shipyards themselves were political centers. Arguments over wages, wood supply, and crew selection could become heated sometimes, literally. One comic playwright joked that Greek shipwrights spent more time debating philosophy than building ships. Whether this was satire or reality is, of course, still debated. Despite the hardship, some rowers found pride in the task. They were part of something massive, mythic. When a trireme launched, the city cheered. Poets sang. Gods were thanked or blamed, depending on how the voyage went. Inscriptions on stone record victories at sea, with the same reverence reserved for temple dedications. And still superstition lingered. Before launch, some captains whispered prayers to Poseidon or Hermes. Others spilled wine on the deck or consulted a rooster. A few even avoided stepping aboard with the left foot first. Apparently, it was considered unlucky. Sleek, sacred, and slightly insane, the trireme wasn't just a ship. It was a statement. A floating testament to Greek ambition, that muscle could become machine, that discipline could beat chaos, and that sometimes war floated on olive oil and pure stubbornness. If Greek triremes were blades, Roman grain freighters were battering rams, slower, heavier, and about as graceful as a stack of amphorae rolling downhill. But make no mistake, these floating warehouses kept the empire alive. Without them, there'd be no bread in Rome, no wages for soldiers, and no statues of emperors pretending to be gods. Just a very hungry capital and some very confused senators. You step aboard one now, a massive wooden tub, bobbing awkwardly in the harbor at Ostia. It creaks even while docked. A sailor slaps pitch onto a leaking seam. Another climbs the rigging to patch a sail with. Is that papyrus? Welcome to ancient logistics. Roman grain freighters, or navis honorarii, weren't built for speed or elegance. They were built to carry volume wheat from Egypt, oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, anything and everything needed to feed a sprawling empire. The average ship could haul hundreds of tons of cargo. Some were so wide that rowing wasn't even an option. They drifted like wooden clouds, pushed by wind, towed by tugs, or simply nudged along by hope. Constructed from planks lashed and pegged together with iron nails, these ships required constant maintenance. Leaks were common. So were broken rudders, torn sails, and splinters the size of daggers. Shipwrights often had to improvise patching holes with linen soaked in resin, stuffing cracks, with wool, even borrowing bits of canvas from retired military tents. And then there were the sails. Massive squares of woven linen often dyed with stripes or symbols to indicate ownership. When damaged, and they often were, they might be repaired with scraps of whatever fabric was handy. One recovered sail fragment bore traces of papyrus stitched in like a desperate afterthought. Some scholars question the practicality of such repairs. Others believe it was simply the cheapest option during emergencies. Navigating these beasts was an art of patience. Captains had to know the currents, time the winds, and pray that pirates weren't lurking beyond the horizon. Convoys were common safer in numbers, even if it meant waiting days for stragglers to catch up. And when storms came, there wasn't much to do but lash everything down and hope the gods were bored that day. Despite their ungainly size, these freighters were crucial. A single grain ship from Alexandria could feed thousands. In times of shortage, their arrival was celebrated like a festival. Citizens lined the docks, cheering, weeping, sometimes even singing. One poet described such a scene with the line, "The bread returns." The sea has not devoured our hope. Of course, it wasn't all glory. Many of these ships had to be repaired so often they practically lived in dry dock. Some never left the port again after their maiden voyage, too warped, too slow, or too cursed to bother. A few were even converted into floating warehouses, fish markets, or temples. The boundary between vessel and venue was flexible. Who truly ruled the Roman seas, the Navy, with its swift warships, or the grain freighters, bloated and barnacled? Historians remain divided. But one thing is clear, without these lumbering leviathans, Rome's mighty roar would have sounded more like a stomach growling. You hear it before you see it. The cheerful rhythm of saws, the call of birds nesting in the rafters, and the strange, delicate harmonies of flutes echoing across the shipyard. Welcome to Song Dynasty China, where shipbuilding was a blend of science superstition and astonishing innovation. Here, amid clouds of sawdust and streaks of sunlight, something truly ahead of its time is taking shape: the Chinese junk. Step onto the wooden scaffolding of a nearly completed vessel. Workers in linen robes glide between planks, singing softly as they plane beams with bronze tools. A small boy scatters rice onto the deck in an ancient blessing. Overhead, a towering rudder swings gently in the breeze, taller than a warhorse and just as imposing. Chinese junks weren't just advanced, they were centuries ahead of their Western counterparts. Flat-bottomed for river or sea, travel with watertight compartments built directly into the hull, they were remarkably stable. These compartments, separated by bulkheads, meant a single leak wouldn't sink the ship. If one section flooded, the others kept the vessel afloat. In modern terms, it was like inventing airbags in the 12th century. Shipwrights of the Song dynasty took full advantage of this. They built bigger, bolder, more versatile ships, some for fishing, others for trade, and a few for long-distance exploration. Junks could carry silk spices, porcelain, or soldiers. Their sails, typically battened and rigged for quick adjustment, allowed for impressive maneuverability. One Admiral Zheng He would later command treasure fleets that spanned oceans. But even these early junks had a mystical streak. Builders often painted eyes near the bow, believing the ship needed vision to find safe passage. Others carved dragons or cranes into the stern post, symbols of strength and grace. One recovered rudder bore tiny charms tucked into its grooves, amulets meant to protect against storm spirits and sea demons. There's scholarly disagreement over exactly when the true junk design emerged. Some trace it to earlier dynasties. Others claim it wasn't standardized until much later. But most agree that Song-era shipbuilding was a turning point not just for China, but for global maritime history. Techniques first seen here would ripple outward for centuries. And then there's the dry dock. Chinese shipyards developed massive timber frameworks to construct ships above waterline, allowing builders to rotate hulls and repair lower planks with ease. This level of engineering sophistication wouldn't be seen in Europe for hundreds of years. In some cases, shipwrights even installed wheel systems beneath hulls for launch a mix of physics, patience, and poetry. Despite all this brilliance, ancient Chinese shipbuilders were rarely memorialized. Their names, if recorded at all, were buried in supply logs and warehouse rosters. But walk through a surviving dock site and you'll feel their presence, the alignment of beams, the brushstrokes on painted hulls, the quiet confidence of balanced design. One myth tells of a shipwright who built a junk so perfectly balanced that it never rocked even in a storm. People whispered that it was alive. It vanished during a typhoon. No wreck, no driftwood, no trace. Some say it still sails beneath the sea, guiding lost vessels home. Whether or not the legend is true, it speaks to how the Chinese saw their ships not just as tools, but as beings, vessels of trade, travel, and quiet magic. Far south of China's harbors, in the dense green world of ancient South India, the rhythm of shipbuilding takes on a different tone, slower, more sacred, and steeped in ritual. Here, under banyan trees and monsoon clouds, artisans didn't just build ships, they built offerings. A teak hull might be soaked in turmeric, a hammer might double as a drum, and every nail-driven home was one step closer to pleasing the sea. You walk into a humid dockyard near the ancient port of Muziris. It smells of spice and resin-wet wood and roasted rice. Builders squat barefoot on thick timbers, their hands stained yellow from turmeric and oil. Coconut husks smolder in clay braziers to keep insects at bay. Above them, wind chimes made of seashells sing to the gods. These were the Hindu ocean builders, craftsmen and craftswomen who turned tropical trees into floating sanctuaries. Teak was the favored wood, strong water resistant, and believed to carry protective spirits. Hulls were shaped with curved axes, then blessed with rice flowers and prayers before the first voyage. Some shipbuilders traced sacred mandalas onto the keel before hammering the first peg. South Indian ships were known for their versatility. Some were sleek, narrow transports for spices and textiles. Others were larger multi-decked vessels capable of ocean crossings, sailing as far as Arabia or Southeast Asia. And some, according to local tradition, functioned as mobile temples, complete with idols, altars, and incense burners. The sea wasn't just a highway. It was divine territory. Artisans often sang while they worked, not to pass time, but to maintain rhythm and invoke divine favor. Chants blended with hammer strokes, creating a soundscape as old as the sea itself. One Tamil poem describes boat builders as the singers who shaped salt wood into prayers. Scholars remain uncertain whether these poetic references describe real rituals or literary exaggeration. Either way, the image is unforgettable. Even the choice of paint had purpose. Red ochre symbolized Mars and protection. White lime soothed angry tides. Some ships bore eyes painted in a peacock's palette, turquoise green gold. Others featured carved lions, elephants, or lotus petals around the bow, all deeply symbolic and fiercely local. Before launch ships were often sprinkled with milk and honey. Some owners held small ceremonies involving coconuts cracked open on the prow to ensure safe travels. One persistent superstition warned against launching a ship during certain moon phases. Another claimed that stepping aboard with the left foot would doom the voyage. Some rituals were passed down in palm leaf scrolls. Others existed only in muscle memory. Historians still debate the full extent of South India's maritime reach. Some inscriptions speak of Tamil ships reaching Roman Egypt. Others suggest voyages to the Malay archipelago and beyond. There's archaeological evidence of Indian coins in Indonesia and amphorae fragments along the Red Sea coast, but connecting the dots is murky work. What's clear is that these ships and the people who built them were part of a vast quiet network of trade and faith. One recovered hull fragment shows signs of both fire and patchwork. Perhaps a ship that burned was saved and kept sailing. Another was found reused as a house wall. In a way, every ship built here carried more than cargo. It carried belief that the ocean was a place of return, that the gods watched over travelers. That craftsmanship was itself a kind of devotion. And maybe, just maybe, a blessed ship floated a little higher than one built with mere math. Out where the ocean blends into sky, where no land is visible and stars blink like ancient compasses, a different kind of shipbuilder labored not in dockyards, but on beaches. Not with nails, but with fiber. In the vast blue realm of Polynesia, boats were sewn, not hammered, and guided by priests who read constellations like maps. These weren't just vessels, they were floating prayers. Now picture yourself on a quiet shore at dawn. Two long hulls lie on the sand, lashed with twisted coconut fiber. A third smaller hull sits beside them, carved with bird motifs and rubbed with oil. A navigator hums a chant to the rising sun. Children trace patterns in the sand that look suspiciously like wind diagrams. Polynesian canoe innovations were nothing short of miraculous. Using only stone tools, natural adhesives, and plant-based rope islanders created catamarans that could cross thousands of miles. The double hull design offered stability in heavy swells, while shallow drafts let them skim over coral reefs. Each part of the canoe had a name, a story, a lineage. Some were passed down for generations, their hulls constantly repaired and re-blessed. The hulls weren't just lashed, they were sewn. Holes were drilled in the wood, then stitched together with senet, a braided cord made from coconut husk. When wet, the fibers expanded, sealing the joints tighter. It was flexible, strong, and easily replaced. Early European explorers marveled at these canoes' durability. Some thought them too light for the sea until they saw one ride out a storm without flinching. Navigation, too, was an art and a science. Polynesian star priests called wayfinders used no maps or instruments. Instead, they read stars, ocean swells, bird migrations, and cloud shapes. They knew which islands lay past which constellations and how moonlight reflected off different water depths. A single feather drifting on the tide might signal land. A sudden shift in swell pattern could mean an island over the horizon. Researchers still debate how this knowledge was taught formally or through osmosis. These voyages were sacred. Before departure, the canoe would be blessed often by an elder or priest. Offerings might include flowers, taro root, or a carved bird figure tied to the prow. If the voyage failed, the blame might fall on the navigator or the bird. One chant recorded in the 19th century lists over 100 stars used for navigation. Another, known as the paddle song, was sung to maintain rhythm and morale during long journeys. Some believe these chants also carried coded instructions for steering and emergency landings. Scholars still argue whether such embedded instructions were common or exceptional. Polynesian shipbuilders often worked in silence, speaking only in metaphors or riddles during construction. It was said that too much chatter might confuse the canoe's spirit. One legend tells of a canoe that sank repeatedly until the builders finally stopped discussing fish recipes while working. After that, smooth sailing. As with many traditional practices, Colonization and missionary influence disrupted the transmission of shipbuilding lore. By the 20th century, many skills had faded. But in recent decades, Polynesian communities have revived these techniques, building canoes, retraining navigators, and crossing oceans, once more guided only by stars and memory. So when you see a map of the Pacific, don't think of it as empty. Think of it as crowded with invisible highways, sacred songs, and canoes gliding across night-black waters. Part shrine, part ship, all wonder. Sometimes the best way to learn how something was built is to watch it sink. Or more accurately, to examine the soggy remains centuries later. Shipwrecks are messy teachers, crushed hulls, warped planks, barnacled nails, but they whisper secrets louder than any scroll. In the stillness of the deep, ancient shipbuilders leave behind their most honest work. You're diving now, slowly weightless, drifting over the ruins of a ship no human has touched for 2,000 years. Its ribs jut from the sand like bones. Nearby, amphorae lies scattered like forgotten prayers. And tucked beneath the silt, a perfect wooden peg still snug in place. Underwater archaeology has revealed stunning details about ship construction across cultures. In the Mediterranean, sunken triremes show how planks were stitched with rope before being sealed with pitch. In Scandinavia, Viking wrecks display overlapping clinker boards held fast by iron rivets. Each wreck is a time capsule not of conquest or cargo, but of craftsmanship. Some ships seem frozen mid-repair. One Phoenician wreck near Malta had tools scattered across the deck as if the crew stopped working only seconds before disaster. Another, found off the Turkish coast, bore patches made of mismatched woods, evidence of desperate last-minute fixes. Scholars still debate whether these were emergency repairs or signs of a rushed launch. Either way, they suggest anxiety in the yard. Some wrecks are stunningly preserved. The cold, oxygen-poor depths of the Black Sea have yielded entire vessels' masts, still standing rope coils intact, even decorative carvings peeking through algae. One Greek merchant ship still had a jar of pickled fish on board. Researchers remain divided over whether the fish was cargo or someone's lunch. Of particular interest are the construction techniques visible only after a wreck. Builders often inserted small markers, wooden dowels, ink dots, carved fish symbols to track plank alignment or load balance. These marks were never meant to be seen again, and yet in the quiet of a deep-sea trench, they endure. Occasionally, a wreck defies all expectations. A Roman freighter discovered off Sicily showed signs of intentional scuttling, a small hole drilled from the inside, cargo removed beforehand. Why would someone sink a perfectly good ship insurance fraud ritual disposal, or perhaps a final act of vengeance? There's no scholarly consensus. One wreck off Japan contained no metal at all, everything bound with wooden joints and fiber lashings. It was so well built, archaeologists initially mistook it for a modern imitation. A nearby wreck, by contrast, looked like a rush school project: crooked beams, poorly sealed seams, and missing fasteners. The contrast is humbling. Even in ancient times, not every builder was a master. There's also the emotional weight. Some wrecks bear traces of panic-spilled tools, broken amphorae, scattered personal belongings. One child-sized sandal was found near a collapsed bulkhead, a gentle reminder that these were not just machines, they were homes, workplaces, and sometimes tombs. In the end, shipwrecks don't lie. They show what worked, what failed, and what mattered most to the builders who disappeared beneath the waves. No ceremony, no mythology. Just timber tar and truth preserved by pressure. salt, and time. The sound of hammers echoes again, but not in battle or storm. This time, it's the quiet thump of daily labor in a dusty dockyard. There are no cheers, no royal launches, just workers in tunics, wiping sweat with sawdust-streaked sleeves, trying to finish a hull before sunset. This is where ships were really born, not on the sea, but in the laughter, grumbling and aching backs of the people who made them. Step into the shadow of a half-built vessel in ancient Athens or Alexandria or Luoyang. The yard smells of wet rope stale beer and the occasional roasted fish. Chickens wander beneath scaffolding. A group of apprentices argues over whose turn it is to fetch more nails. One uses a fishbone to mark a plank having long lost his chalk. This is dockyard daily life, not glamorous, but essential. In most cultures, shipyards operated like small cities. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, sail weavers worked side by side, each with a role to play. Some were salaried, others paid per plank. There were foremen who shouted, scribes who tracked materials, and gossips who knew which fleet had recently returned or vanished. Tools clattered constantly. Sawdust fell like snow. Somewhere a flute played. Food was simple, but vital bread. Dried fish beer, maybe a fig if luck was good. Workers often ate on site, sitting on beams or hulls in progress. One Babylonian tablet mentions a shipyard menu including lentil stew and pickled onions. Another refers cryptically to midday bitterness, which some interpret as a reference to strong beer or just Mondays. Training was informal. A child might start by holding nails, then progress to sanding sawing, and eventually carving their own signature into the wood. Some shipyards encouraged apprentices to personalize their tools. One recovered chisel bore a carved dolphin, another, a string of curse words. Researchers continue to debate whether these docks functioned as true schools or informal guilds. Superstition thrived here too. Some builders refused to hammer after sundown. Others avoided using odd-numbered pegs. A popular Roman habit involved spitting on the keel before sealing it, a gesture of luck or dismissal, depending on who you asked. One ancient Egyptian dock included a shrine to the god Ptah, protector of craftsmen. Workers offered incense and copper trinkets, hoping for smooth timbers and no splinters. Despite their central role, dock workers were rarely honored. Their names don't appear in victory inscriptions or royal decrees. And yet, without them, no admiral sailed, no merchant grew rich, no king was ferried to his afterlife. Their daily grind kept civilizations afloat literally. One recovered plank from a Mediterranean wreck bore tiny etchings, tally marks of crude fish, and what may be a love note or a bet. Historians still debate the meaning, but the presence is undeniable. A hand once held that plank, shaped it, cursed it, maybe even sang to it, and now, centuries later, you can still see the trace. So the next time you picture an ancient ship, don't imagine it alone at sea. Imagine this, a noisy yard, sun-drenched and full of chatter, saws rasping, tools clinking, and a crew of humans tired, clever, laughing, building history, one splinter at a time. The tools of ancient shipbuilders didn't glitter. They didn't beep or blink or come with lifetime warranties. They were crude, heavy, and often handmade. But in the right hands, a chipped bronze chisel or a bone measuring rod could birth a vessel fit for kings, or at least for 3 goats and a jar of pickled olives. Now imagine a low wooden workbench littered with objects, a hammer shaped like a flattened mushroom, a stone axe wrapped in sinew, a bronze plane so polished it reflects your squinting face. A child runs past with a bucket of resin. Somewhere someone sneezes from sawdust. This isn't a blacksmith's forge or a temple. It's a toolbox in motion. Ancient shipbuilders worked with whatever they could get, usually not much. Bronze chisels were prized especially in early shipyards. They held a sharp edge, but dulled quickly, requiring constant sharpening. Iron tools arrived later heavier and stronger, but also more prone to rust, especially in damp coastal air. For precise angles or consistent widths, builders used measuring rods made from carved bone or notched wood. Some rods were marked with fish stars or moons, part measurement, part charm. Paintbrushes, when used, might be made from animal hair tied to sticks. Awls were often carved from antler or bone. One recovered tool, set from an Aegean wreck, included a curved scraper with a handle inlaid with tiny seashells. Scholars disagree whether this was ceremonial decorative or just the work of someone who got bored one rainy afternoon. And then there were the rituals. Tools weren't just tools, they were companions, sometimes named, often blessed. Some builders muttered incantations before each use. One Phoenician legend tells of a chisel that refused to cut crooked wood as if offended. Another story from South India describes a mallet that had to be put to sleep in rice before being used each morning. Superstitions ran deep. Shipbuilders avoided using tools borrowed from other yards. Bad luck, they said, especially if the previous user was clumsy. One shipwreck yielded a hammer with its handle wrapped in red thread, possibly to ward off evil spirits. Some scholars argue this was simply for grip. Others suspect it was both. Decorative painting also carried spiritual weight. Eyes painted on the prow were common from Egypt to Greece, believed to help the ship see danger. Some yards went further, painting the entire hull in symbols patterns or abstract waves meant to confuse sea monsters. A few designs were clearly playful, smiley faces, rude gestures, or dancing goats. One Chinese boat fragment bore a tiny image of a man rowing backwards. No one knows why. Debate continues over whether such decorations were meant for God's sailors or simply the ship itself. In many cultures, vessels were considered alive. Naming a ship wasn't just custom, it was identity. To insult a ship's name was to invite disaster. Some builders whispered apologies to hulls if they had to make last-minute changes. As for mistakes, they happened. A mismeasured plank, a warped beam, a nail driven into the wrong spot. In one Roman shipyard, a disgruntled scribe recorded 17 curses for a miscut rudder, none of which were appropriate for polite society. In the end, shipbuilding tools weren't just extensions of the hand, they were extensions of belief. Part science, part ceremony, and all essential. So next time you pass a toolbox, imagine it filled not just with hammers and chisels, but with hope, fear, and a little bit of magic. For every triumphant launch, there was a ship that limped or sank before it even met the tide. These were the problem children of ancient shipbuilding, warped, wobbly, unbalanced, or just plain cursed. Some keeled over mid-launch. Others floated for a day listed dangerously, then returned to the yard in shame. When ships went wrong, the results were often hilarious, sometimes tragic, and always revealing. Picture a crowd gathered for a launch ceremony. Incense curls through the air. A priest chants. A goat is mildly alarmed. The ship is released only to tilt sharply, catch on a hidden sandbar, and eject its passengers into waist-high water. Applause turns to awkward silence. One man coughs. A boy claps anyway. Ancient builders made mistakes like anyone else, but the consequences were bigger, more public, more expensive, and more dangerous. A single misaligned beam could doom the entire structure. One Egyptian record speaks of a royal barge that capsized before the pharaoh ever saw it. The builders were reassigned to a desert project, possibly involving fewer boats. Some ships simply weren't seaworthy. In Mesopotamia, poorly sealed bitumen could crack under heat, causing hulls to leak within hours. One infamous Greek ship was so unbalanced it had to be loaded with amphorae on one side just to stay upright. And a Roman freighter once arrived in port with its stern completely missing, torn away by a poorly designed rudder system that acted more like an anchor than a guide. When disaster struck, causes varied. Sometimes it was design keels, too short, hulls, too wide masts placed off center. Other times it was material warped wood, brittle nails, or cheap rope. But just as often, people blamed the gods. Perhaps a neglected offering, an unlucky name, or a jealous spirit. In South India, one launch failed 3 times until the builders sacrificed a watermelon in apology. It worked. Probably coincidence? Maybe not. There are stories, half historical, half gossip, about ships cursed by rival yards. One Phoenician tale tells of a merchant whose competitors sabotaged his launch by swapping the front and back sails. The ship sailed fine just backwards. The crew pretended it was intentional. Historians remain divided on whether this was a prank or a parable. Some failed ships found second lives. A Mycenaean hulk, too heavy for rowing, was converted into a floating granary. In Japan, a misaligned cargo vessel became a riverside bathhouse. In Alexandria, a leaky passenger boat was dragged ashore patched with clay and turned into a bakery. The heat kept the dough rising and the jokes flowing. There's a strange comfort in these failures. They remind us that even master builders made flawed guesses, that ancient engineering was often trial and error, that not every ship was born to sail. Some were born to teach to amuse or to serve as stern warnings carved into yard posts. And yet, even in failure, these ships were honored. The launch still happened. The prayers were still said. The boat, however crooked, still had a name. So next time you think history is just victories and greatness, remember this, somewhere out there in a forgotten dock. A shipbuilder once whispered, well, that's not ideal, and kept hammering anyway. Legacy is a funny thing. Sometimes it's carved into marble. Sometimes it's etched into laws or passed down in song. And sometimes it floats quietly across centuries in the curve of a hull, the sound of a hammer strike, or the whisper of a launch chant on a distant shore. Even after their tools rusted and their names vanished, the ancient shipbuilders left fingerprints in places most of us never think to look. You board a modern ferry in the Mediterranean. It hums with engines and air conditioning, but when you look closely at the joinery along the railing, something feels familiar. A pattern, a technique, a shadow of something older. The dockhands shout across the pier, and one of them casually slaps the keel with a flat palm before boarding, just for luck. Many practices from ancient shipbuilding survived in strange and subtle ways. The mortise and tenon joints used in Greek triremes are echoed in wooden boats still built along the Nile. Polynesian canoe lashing techniques are taught in cultural revival workshops across the Pacific. And in parts of Kerala, craftsmen still bless hulls with turmeric and rice before their first launch. The very word starboard comes from the Old Norse styrboard, meaning the steering side, because Viking ships didn't have central rudders, just steering oars on the right. Even the concept of a figurehead persists in nautical design, though today it's mostly symbolic. And if you've ever seen painted eyes on a fishing boat in Greece, you're looking at a tradition that stretches back to Egyptian rivercraft. There are launch chants, too. One island off the coast of Japan still recites a low rhythmic prayer before setting a boat to sea. Its origin is unclear, but the words include references to balance wind and forgiving tides. Whether the chant is 5 centuries old or 5,000, no one knows. But it works. That's enough. Historians still debate just how much ancient knowledge truly survives. Some argue that modern shipbuilding owes everything to industrial innovation. Others insist that the core ideas balance buoyancy, spiritual respect, haven't changed since someone first tied logs together and dared the river. Sometimes, ancient blueprints were rediscovered by accident. One Renaissance shipwright claimed his greatest inspiration came not from scholarly texts, but from staring at a barnacled wreck pulled from the sea near Rhodes. He sketched its ribs, copied its angles, and swore he heard it speak to him as he drew. There's poetry in that. The idea that a silent, sunken thing could teach again. That even decay carries wisdom. That a ship, though broken, can still carry stories. And that's what these ancient builders gave us. Not just boats, but metaphors, arcs across time. Proof that humans have always looked at water and thought, what if I floated? So the next time you cross a bridge, ride a ferry, or watch a boat drift across the horizon, remember the hands that shaped the first ones, the songs they sang, the risks they took, the blisters, the blessings, the 1,000 tiny choices that kept timber from becoming firewood and turned it instead into possibility. You might think that ancient ships only passed down blueprints, but they also passed down bedtimes. Because when the hammering stopped and the tide came in, every sailor had to sleep somewhere. Even if that somewhere was half a net and the heel of someone's foot. There's something oddly democratic about a cramped ship. It doesn't matter if you're an oarsman, a cook, or a priest. You're sleeping in a wedge of deck no bigger than a dining tray. Ancient Greek triremes were long and sleek, but the crew spaces were brutally tight. 2 men to an oar, 3 decks stacked like fish crates, and barely enough headroom to sneeze. At night, you wriggle into a nook between baskets' barrels and the warm shoulder of a man named something like Akthonios, who's snoring into a moldy net. If you're lucky, your spot doesn't tilt every time someone uses the bilge bucket. If you're unlucky, you're under that bucket. Sailors often slept directly on cargo olive jars, amphorae of wine stacks of rope, or dried meat. The ship was the bedroom, pantry, chapel, and prison all in one. There's no below-deck luxury here, just wood sweat and the lullaby of rats gnawing on lentil crumbs. And yes, those hammocks you've heard of. They weren't common in ancient Europe. The idea of a swinging cloth bed doesn't show up in Mediterranean cultures until much later, possibly imported from the Americas. Instead, some sailors used woven nets suspended between posts, more cargo sling than comfort cocoon. Most didn't even get that. A pile of rags or the coiled tail of a fishing line might count as a pillow. Odors were part of the experience too. Pine pitch sealing the hull, sour fish oil from the lamps, the occasional whiff of fermented cabbage stew leaking from a cracked pot. You couldn't escape the smells, but after enough sleepless nights, you stopped noticing them mostly, except for the tar. That always lingered in your nose like a wax seal on your sinuses. Some historians argue that ships tried to enforce a sleep schedule, half the crew resting while the other half rowed. But with storms, pirates, and surprise ore drills, sleep was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. One scratched note found in a Roman wreck reads simply 2 hours, 3 dreams, one elbow bruise. The ship groans again, this time not from snoring. It's the slow shuffle of someone checking the hold, and with it comes a hollow clink. Not bells, but something else entirely jars. Dozens of them, stacked like sleepy little sentries in the dark. You follow the sound. Welcome to the ship's pantry, or what passes for one when you're a week from port and your cheese has turned green in protest. Ancient sailors had a simple culinary goal: keep food from killing them. That meant preservation, and lots of it. Salted fish, hardtack biscuits, sour wine, and fermented cabbage were staples. Meals were chosen not for flavor, but for endurance. The bread baked until it could dent armor. The wine, more sludge than sip, often mixed with seawater to stretch it. Storage took creativity. Clay amphorae lined the hold, their pointed bottoms wedged into sand or wooden racks to keep them from tipping in rough seas. The clinking sound was them swaying gently like lazy bells. Many were sealed with wax or resin-soaked fabric to trap the contents inside and keep air and mice out. Grains and beans went into woven baskets, sometimes doubled up in layers of cloth. Meat, if you had any, was usually salted or smoked so aggressively that chewing it required teamwork. There are stories of Roman sailors softening their meat under their armpits before biting in. Whether that's culinary strategy or gallows humor remains a matter of scholarly disagreement. Water posed a constant problem. Barrels might start the journey full of fresh spring liquid, but after a few days in the heat, algae and slime turned them into soups best avoided. That's partly why the wine was so thick and sour. It killed off whatever might be lurking in your cup. Unfortunately, it also made you dream of home, or of rats drinking it first. Some ships experimented with cool storage tricks. A few tried submerging amphorae in ocean water to keep them cooler, though waves had a habit of knocking things loose. Others lined barrels with lead to prevent spoilage, unaware they were slowly poisoning the crew. There's no scholarly consensus on whether any of these methods worked reliably, but at least they made the crew feel like someone was trying. Spoilage was common. Sailors developed an eye for suspicious weevils and a nose for cabbage that had turned mean. A good cook could turn spoiled lentils into a passable stew with enough onions and dried herbs until someone noticed the lentils crawling. One peculiar item often overlooked in ship inventories: vinegar, not just for cleaning wounds or rinsing chamber pots, more on that later, but for refreshing old bread. Soak it just long enough, and you could trick your teeth into thinking you were eating something edible. Just don't expect compliments. As for the galley, if you can call it that, it was often no more than a flat stone or metal pan set over a bucket of coals. Cooking was banned during storms and frowned upon during mutiny. The sound of soft chirping catches your attention, barely audible over the creak of timbers and the splash of waves. You squint into the shadows and spot something odd: a small cage swinging gently from a beam with a very smug-looking parrot inside. Not all sailors were human. Ancient ships carried an unexpected assortment of animal companions: cats, dogs, monkeys, birds, and on one famously superstitious Phoenician vessel, a rooster believed to warn of approaching storms. These creatures served as pets, mascots, rat catchers, and sometimes omens. Cats were perhaps the most common. Agile, low maintenance, and excellent at dispatching rodents, they earned their keep quickly. Sailors treated them like tiny gods, though some would mutter about curses if a cat jumped onto the rigging during a red moon. One Egyptian inscription even calls a cat chief of grain security, a title that likely amused the feline more than the crew. Parrots and monkeys, meanwhile, were favored by merchants and higher-ranking officers. Imported from distant colonies or gifted by coastal traders, these creatures brought color and chaos to otherwise dreary voyages. A monkey named Bashtu once tore apart a sacred scroll mid-crossing, causing the ship's priest to declare the voyage cursed. The monkey was promoted to assistant scribe, at least in jest. Roosters and hens had practical uses: eggs, meat, and morning alarm calls, but some acquired spiritual status. One crew refused to eat their rooster after it allegedly predicted a pirate attack by crowing nonstop at night. The bird was spared, named Captain Pex, and reportedly outlived half the crew. Animals weren't just good luck charms. They were companions in the truest sense, creatures who didn't shout, didn't complain, and didn't care about oar drills. When storms hit and the deck tilted, sailors clutched their pets with more desperation than their tools. There is ongoing debate among scholars about how widespread animal companions were on ancient vessels. Some argue that only wealthy or state-run ships could afford to house and feed non-essential animals. Others believe that even small cargo ships carried creatures, especially those with rodent problems. Surviving shipwreck evidence is limited bones, scratch marks, or the occasional carved likeness are all we have. One carved figurehead recovered from a Greek wreck shows what appears to be a dog with fish fins. Whether it was a mythical symbol or just artistic license is unclear. But it hints at the bond between sailor and beast, one forged not in luxury, but in shared discomfort. Pets gave the crew something to laugh about: a monkey that mimicked the captain, a cat that only sat on the sacred helm, a parrot that swore in 3 languages. They weren't just mascots. They were tiny bits of sanity in a world that smelled like old onions and vinegar foot baths. And sometimes, when a sailor passed, their pet would sit at the edge of the ship for hours, quiet, watchful, unmoving, waiting for a voice that wouldn't return. A low hum rises from the stern, not the wind, not a prayer, but a song. Half sung, half grunted, it blends with the rhythmic thump of wood against rope. Sailors, it seems, are finding ways to stay sane. Welcome to shipboard entertainment, where the stage is a barrel lid, the dice are carved from bones, and the stakes range from olive rations to who gets to nap on the driest part of the floor. Entertainment aboard ancient ships was as improvised as it was essential. With no horizon but sea and days blurring into one another, sailors invented distractions. Dice games were popular, often crafted from pebble's bone or broken amphory. Some crews carried small gaming boards, scratched into planks or crates. A favorite pastime among Phoenician sailors, whittling little gods from driftwood mini-deities of luck, sea, and sarcasm. Singing was perhaps the most beloved activity, though it could also stir tension. Crews divided into chant circles, each side trying to outsing or out-insult the other. These rival chants, some historians believe, served as both bonding rituals and unspoken competitions. A good verse could earn extra figs. A bad one, you might get dunked during bath duty. Sometimes entertainment turned physical. Wrestling matches on calm days gave rowers a way to stretch and release tension. The cargo hold, cleared of breakables, became an informal arena. Winners strutted, losers limped, and captains either cheered or grumbled depending on the bruises. There's mention of a Roman merchant vessel whose crew hosted tow duels, the rules of which are lost to time, but likely involved more giggles than glory. Sculpting and carving were common too. One sailor carved a likeness of his wife into the mast using a spoon and nail. Another made tiny ships from fish bones and floated them during mealtime races. Some of these crafts found in shipwrecks show surprising detail evidence that boredom fuels artistry. But not every ship welcomed such pastimes. Some captains saw games as dangerous distractions. One decree from an Athenian admiral forbade music after sunset, claiming it disturbed the winds and inflamed the oars. Whether this was superstition or control is debated, but it sparked secret concerts below deck. Interestingly, religious storytelling also served as entertainment. Sailors swapped tales of sea gods, revengeful spirits, and mythical islands. These stories weren't just pastime, they were survival guides in disguise, warning what not to do, who not to offend, and how to bribe a kraken with garlic and poetry. There is no scholarly consensus on how widespread or tolerated these amusements were. Some argue that only merchant or private ships had time for leisure, while war vessels demanded stricter discipline. Yet enough records carvings and crew scribbles survive to suggest that even the grimmest galleys needed the occasional laugh. After all, when your bed is a sack of onions and your job involves hauling soaked rope in the dark, a badly carved god or off-key sea chant might be the only thing keeping your grip on reality and your place on the ship. The laughter fades as a crewman hurries by, with a bucket in one hand and an expression of mild dread. He ducks behind a stack of amphorae, disappears into the shadows, and the problem of hygiene becomes suddenly and vividly real. Toilets aboard ancient ships were less a convenience and more a creative gamble. Sanitation, in its seaborne form, was an ever-evolving art of awkward angles and personal risk. Most ships had no designated bathroom at all. Instead, sailors relieved themselves over the sides, clutching ropes, balancing on slippery planks, hoping a rogue wave didn't interrupt their moment of privacy. Some vessels offered plank holes strategically carved into the outer decking with just enough width to squat, and enough wind to make you question your life choices. Chamber pots were more common on merchant or officer-level vessels, usually tucked near sleeping quarters or stored in a niche below deck. These pots were emptied ideally overboard, though some unfortunate accounts suggest delays in disposal during bad weather, creating what one Roman journal described as unholy vapors in the lower deck. To combat odors and bacteria, vinegar was a sailor's best friend. Mixed with seawater, it was used for rinsing pots, scrubbing calloused feet, and occasionally gargling, though this last use is still debated by historians who question the sanity of that idea. Some amphorae found in wrecks contain traces of tart liquids, believed to be cleaning solutions stored separately from food or wine. Fleas and lice thrived in the warm, damp environment of a crowded ship. Sailors fought them with ash rubs, vinegar rinses, and the frequent use of shared bone combs. These combs, often carved with personal sigils or prayers, were kept in communal boxes or tied to posts with leather strings. One surviving comb reads, "For clean minds and clear skies," etched in shaky Latin. Mold was another constant. It crept into baskets, bloomed in damp ropes, and colonized the crevices between deck boards. Sailors scrubbed with sand and seawater scraped with flattened shells, and sometimes lit small fires in enclosed corners to smoke out the damp. This tactic worked better in theory than practice, and often ended with wheezing lungs and annoyed captains. Some ships appointed a hygiene officer, not an official title, but usually the cleanest or crankiest man on board, who enforced scrubbing routines, checked water barrels for slime, and occasionally threw someone's bedding overboard for the greater good. One Athenian crew called their sanitation enforcer the Vinegar Oracle. Despite these efforts, disease still spread. One sneeze could doom half the ship. Crews blamed everything from sea spirits to spoiled lentils. When someone grew too ill, they were given space near the bow, or if superstition demanded tied gently to the mast to purge their fever into the wind. Researchers continue to debate just how effective these hygiene methods were. Some suggest sailors fared surprisingly well thanks to salt air and rigorous scrubbing. Others point to widespread infections and parasite infestations in skeletal remains. But in the end, cleanliness wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. And the rare luxury of not smelling like someone else's lunch. The ship lurches to one side. A sharp gust rips through the rigging, followed by a deep, almost groaning creak from the mast. Somewhere below deck, someone knocks over a pot. But above it all, what really freezes the spine is the sudden silence from the crew. Storm coming. Ancient sailors feared storms with a reverence that bordered on spiritual terror. Without modern forecasts, the sea itself was the only warning system: clouds the wrong color waves turning flat and glassy seagulls flying the wrong way. When nature shifted tone, so did the crew. The dice stopped rolling. The jokes died down. Eyes turned skyward. As lightning bloomed over the horizon, sailors reached for whatever superstitions they could muster. Roman crews tossed coins into the waves for Neptune. Greek oarsmen whispered prayers to Poseidon. Phoenician merchants scattered garlic near the prow, meant to ward off sea spirits with damp appetites. One account claims a Syrian crew once offered a pickled eel to the wind itself, though scholars suspect that may have been a joke passed down through too many generations. But storms weren't the only terror that churned a sailor's gut. Sea monsters as real in the ancient mind as hunger or thirst haunted nearly every map and bedtime story. Tentacled beasts, ship-swallowing serpents, and crab-bodied creatures with glowing eyes were said to live in the depths. Some ships carried charms carved squid driftwood mermaids, even tiny shrines of storm gods made from fish bones. One Greek merchant trireme reportedly featured a mast painted with an enormous eye meant to scare sea beasts back into the deep. Historians still argue whether these monsters were metaphor misidentified whales or simply an excuse for bad navigation. One scholar suggests the many-eyed beast described in Egyptian logs might have been a large cuttlefish seen through alcohol-fogged eyes. Others believe the tales were cautionary myths told by older sailors to frighten newcomers into obedience. Still, belief had power. If a crew believed something terrible lay ahead, it changed how they moved. They tightened ropes with trembling hands. They murmured to their charms. They sang lower and slower. There are records of ships rerouting entire voyages to avoid cursed waters. One Roman captain allegedly ordered his vessel turned back after a deckhand dreamed of a winged eel. Another changed course for 3 extra days because the clouds looked too much like teeth. To keep calm during storms, some captains banned speaking altogether. Silence, they believed, kept the sea from hearing fear. Others encouraged singing low rhythmic chants meant to anchor the spirit while the body braced. One tradition involved biting down on a rope during the worst waves, both to stay focused and to avoid biting your own tongue. Whether that actually helped or just gave sailors something to do remains uncertain. But whether through silence or garlic song or squid charms, one thing was clear. Storms reminded every sailor that the sea obeyed no man. You didn't fight it. You bargained. You pleaded. You survived. And sometimes you swore you saw something blink beneath the waves. The storm has passed, leaving behind a deck slick with seawater, a rope's worth of bruises, and something worse, a sick bay. Or rather, the closest thing to it, a corner below deck, lit by a trembling lantern and perfumed with the sharp sting of vinegar and something suspiciously like pickled onions. You've arrived at the ship's humble hospital. There was no uniformed doctor, no polished tools, and no soothing tea. Healing aboard an ancient vessel required creativity, courage, and an unsettling tolerance for mold. The ship's healer, if it had one, might be a retired soldier, a priest, or the oldest sailor who knew the difference between a fever dream and actual death. One such healer kept a leech in a seashell and called it mercy. Moldy bread was a go-to remedy pressed onto wounds in the hope that its strange growths would draw out infection. Remarkably, this practice wasn't entirely misguided. Some molds did contain antibacterial properties, though sailors didn't know the science. They just knew the bread had to be blue fuzzy and smell vaguely like regret. Seaweed poultices were also common. Wrapped around bruises or burns, the slimy strips were thought to soothe and reduce swelling. Some sailors believed red seaweed brought good luck, while green seaweed drew out bad spirits. Whether that meant pus or guilt was left to interpretation. For fevers, the cures ranged from practical to theatrical. Cold cloths dipped in salt water were one option. So was chanting long, low murmurs spoken over the patient's chest. These chants varied by culture, but often invoked sea gods or ancestor spirits. One Carthaginian sailor claimed his fever broke only after a crewmate shouted jokes at his forehead for 2 hours. The historian recording the tale notes, somewhat dryly results not replicable. Toothaches were handled with sharp tools and no small amount of drama. Some ships carried bronze tweezers or fishbone picks, which doubled as splinter removers and dental torturers. A sailor with a sore molar might end up chewing on bits of driftwood soaked in wine, praying the pain left before the tooth did. For stomach ailments, dried herbs mixed with olive oil or ash were sometimes used. But ginger, common in ancient trade, was controversial. Some captains banned it, believing it encouraged ghosts or stirred restless dreams. Others prescribed it with reckless abandon, calling it the root of laughter and bile. The inconsistency led to confusion, and occasionally to mutiny. But that's another section. Bleeding was a nightmare scenario. Ship healers resorted to linen bandages soaked in vinegar, tightened with strips of leather or even fishing net. If bleeding didn't stop, a hot iron or fire-heated bronze plate might be pressed against the wound, more threat than solution. Researchers continue to debate the effectiveness of these treatments. Skeletal remains often show signs of healed injuries, suggesting some care worked. Yet infections, fevers, and minor wounds could still turn fatal. There was no guarantee, only hope, a shell of leeches, and maybe a whispered chant to the wind. And if all else failed, the crew saved a special blanket for those not expected to wake up. The quiet, after a fever, rarely lasted. A sharp whistle, a shouted name, a sudden splash order had to be kept, even if the crew was coughing up dreams. And on ancient ships, discipline wasn't handed out with a warning. It came tied to a rope or salted into your supper. Rules at sea were simple, row. Obey, don't start fires. Break them, and you'd meet the mast. Discipline aboard ancient ships varied from harsh to theatrical. Some crews used oar beatings, quick, public, and humiliating. A crew member who slacked during a storm might be tied to the oar and given 3 hard smacks with a wet rope. The punishment was less about pain and more about spectacle, a warning for others and perhaps a twisted form of entertainment. Food could be weaponized too. Sailors feared losing their stew privileges more than losing a tooth. One ship's log mentions a rower banished to fish skin duty, eating only soup flavored with bones and onion peels for a week. Another crew had an unspoken rule. Bad singers got the onion pot, a cracked clay vessel filled with sour leeks and silence. A certain merchant vessel once made a tone-deaf helmsman hum into the hold to scare off rats. The mast, tall, creaking, indifferent, was the centerpiece of punishment. Offenders were tied to it during storms, during meals, even overnight. Not always tightly, and never without a joke scrawled nearby. Here lies the man who snored too loud, read one bit of charcoal graffiti near a mast on a Greek warship. Captains believed that physical stillness might reset a sailor's focus, or just tire him out. Yet discipline wasn't all cruel. Sometimes it was absurd. One ship created a punishment chant sung off-key by the offender while scrubbing the deck with fish spines. Another crew made wrongdoers reenact sea myths, once forcing a thief to play a sea monster in a barrel, roaring while others threw garlic. But mutiny now, that was a different beast. Mutinies were rare, but they happened. Often sparked by food, unfair treatment, or sheer boredom, they started with whispers and ended with a missing captain or a very wet rebellion. One infamous case involved a stew pot. The crew claimed it had run out of onions for 3 days. The cook said the rats had eaten them. The crew didn't care. The captain was tied with sailcloth and lowered gently into the sea, not drowned, just paddled away until he promised better onions. Historians remain divided on how frequently mutinies occurred. Naval records from the Greeks and Romans suggest tight control, while anecdotal evidence and merchant tales tell of simmering tension bribes and staged accidental mast collapses. Some scholars argue that what we call mutiny might have been no more than an angry gnat or a well-aimed cabbage. Still, captains walked a narrow line. Too soft, and the crew grew sloppy. Too cruel, and the mast became a gallows in waiting. Discipline wasn't just about control, it was about performance. Keep the rules just odd enough, and sailors might obey out of fear, or at least for the promise of better stew. The ship's rhythm softens at night, oars rest, boots stop thudding. Somewhere in the dark, a sailor whispers, not to a crewmate, but to the stars. A name, a promise, may be just a question that only moonlight understands. Welcome to the dreamscape of the ancient sailor. Sleep didn't come easy on a moving plank, surrounded by groaning ropes and garlic-scented nets. But when it did, dreams followed, and not the tame kind. Sailors believed dreams carried meaning, warnings, even orders. A feverish vision of a red-eyed fish might signal bad luck. A dream of walking on land could mean a safe harbor ahead, or your end was near. Many rituals blossomed from this quiet obsession. Some sailors traced their dreams in fish oil on driftwood or deck planks, crude symbols meant to trap the images before they faded. Others whispered their dreams into the sea foam at dawn, hoping the water would carry them to whichever god was listening. Stars were not just navigation tools. They were memory anchors. Certain constellations were linked to specific omens. The rise of Orion might trigger offerings, while a shooting star could make a sailor bite his knuckle and spit into the wind. These gestures weren't superstition, they were survival. Some sailors kept dream journals, if not on parchment, then in their tattoos. Dolphins, anchors, sea serpents, stars each mark told a story. One tattooed oarsman claimed the image on his chest changed in his sleep. Another had a scar in the shape of a fish he once dreamed about devouring his mother. His nickname, Dinner. Researchers remain puzzled by the role dreams played in ancient navigation. Did captains truly alter course based on someone's nightmare? One Phoenician scroll suggests they did. A helmsman reportedly dreamed of a burning lighthouse, and the crew steered west instead of east, narrowly missing a pirate ambush. Of course, the timing might have been pure luck. Still, dream interpretation was serious business. On larger vessels, there might be a designated dream teller, someone often older, who claimed to understand the meanings behind nocturnal visions. These unofficial interpreters walked the line between priest gossip and therapist. Sailors approached them at dawn with hushed voices and wide eyes describing dreams of flying turtles or talking waves. The line between dream and waking world blurred easily at sea. Long shifts, hunger, sunstroke, and the endless rocking could conjure hallucinations. Some sailors spoke of moonlight warnings, messages whispered through the wind or seen in the shimmer on the water. One crew refused to sail past a certain island because two men dreamed of singing crabs there. The island remains uncharted, and the crabs remain unverified. Some captains encouraged dreams. They believed a dreaming crew was more intuitive, more bonded to the sea's rhythm. Others banned such talk entirely, calling it madness wrapped in fish bones. But even they, on the quietest nights, were said to stare a little longer at the moon. Because out there between horizon and hull, sometimes the only guide you had was the voice inside your salted brain. A flutter of feathers, a clack of beak against wood, and then a small scroll tied with twine. It's not magic, but it feels close. You've just witnessed one of the sea's quieter miracles, the arrival of a message that doesn't travel by storm or scream. Messages in the ancient maritime world took many forms, some of them alive. Carrier pigeons were the premium mail service of the seafaring world, especially for coastal and military ships. Light, loyal, and deeply confused by waves, these birds were trained to fly back to a home base when released. One sailor described them as the wind's own scribes. Small wooden cages hung near the helm, and birds were fed sparingly, just enough to keep them motivated to return home. Messages were brief, scrawled onto thin bark or soft cloth. A warning about enemy fleets, news of cargo delays, a personal note asking someone to feed the cat. One Roman commander sent a pigeon during battle containing only one word, oops. But pigeons weren't the only couriers. Some ships used carved driftwood figures, faces animals' abstract glyphs. These floating tokens were tossed into the water, with messages etched or tied on. A carved fish might carry a poem across the current. A wooden hand might warn of plague. Whether these tokens reached anyone is unclear, but the act of sending them seemed to matter more than the result. One sailor tied a note to a coconut and hurled it overboard, convinced the tides would carry it to his sister in Alexandria. Historians remain unconvinced. The coconut was later found by a dolphin or so, the story goes, and the sister never received her message. Some captains loathed this practice. Messages could be intercepted. Birds might betray roots. Others, however, encouraged it. A note drifting across the water was seen as a gesture of faith proof that something might still connect you to dry land. There were even ritual send-offs. Before long, voyages a crew might release a pigeon with no message just to remind the land we still exist. On holy days, ships lit candles and floated them with notes in tiny clay dishes. These fragile lanterns bobbed along the waves until snuffed by spray or swallowed by distance. Scholars continued to debate the practicality of these messages. Pigeons could only fly to a known location. Driftwood didn't obey maps, but archaeological finds, scratched wood bone carvings, and scroll fragments hint that people kept trying. And perhaps that was the point. Because when your world is nothing but sky and salt, a floating message isn't about being found. It's about knowing you were still speaking. That your voice, however soft, however strange, had once sailed away, dancing on feathers or driftwood dreams. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there listened. Harbor in sight. The wind shifts with the scent of olive smoke and something stranger, perfume perhaps, or just the heavy breath of 100 stories colliding at once. This is not just land. This is the edge of everything romance, regret reunion. Dockside farewells were as complex as any naval map. The rituals began days before arrival. Hair-combed tunics, scrubbed charms, polished each man, preparing to appear less barnacle than beast. At bustling ports like Tyre or Piraeus garlands were sold by the handful, meant to soften the sour salt of weeks at sea. Some sailors rubbed olive oil on their arms for shine. Others humorously or not dabbed fish juice behind their ears. The welcomes were loud, the goodbyes louder. A Phoenician custom required at least one person to cry at the dock, preferably a widow, though any convincingly mournful relative would do. Captains believed it appeased the sea to see someone left behind mourning. Love tokens were common. A sailor might hand off a shell, carved with initials, a tiny sandal woven from string, or a pressed olive wrapped in cloth. These weren't grand gestures, just proof that time had passed and feeling had survived. Some swore by the 3 squeeze goodbye, one on the hand, one on the shoulder, and one they'd never speak of again. Women sang at the dock songs, known only to families of seafarers. Men swore promises too large for the wind to carry. Children clutched at tunics with sticky fingers and tear-wet noses. There's an account of a Roman sailor who carved his farewell speech into the hull of the ship so he wouldn't forget it under pressure. Then there were the quiet partings. No crying, no waving. Just a nod between friends. Or a last glance back as the gangplank lifted. Not every romance was romantic. Not every goodbye included a name. Historians debate how lasting these bonds were. Letters from shore hint at both deep devotion and spectacular betrayal. One sailor's wife reportedly ran off with his cousin 3 days after his ship left port. Another man returned home to find his lover had built a shrine in his honor, believing he'd died only to enshrine him with dramatic reluctance upon his return. Still, love stories endured. Sailors wrote poems in the margins of logs. They sketched faces in the condensation of their water jars. One crew invented a game where each man described their partner's laugh without saying her name. The prize was extra dried fruit, the laughter real. No one left harbor the same way twice. Whether in tears or jokes, ceremony or silence, dockside farewells marked the soul. Some sailors took a pebble from the dock and kept it in their sandal for the whole voyage, a reminder of pain perhaps, or just something solid to balance the sea. because on the water, memory floats. And not all goodbyes are sad. Some are just anchors. The sky has darkened again, but not with clouds. It's twilight, that in-between hour, when sails flap softer, when conversations drift toward memory, and when rituals strange, whispered, forgotten, begin to surface like fish from the depths. Onboard candles flicker below deck, their flames trembling against carved beams. It's time for prayers and oaths at sea. Religion aboard ancient ships wasn't confined to temples or shrines. It lived in the routines, the murmurs, the quiet gestures sailors made when no one was looking. Prayer was breath, and bargains spoken into wind, whispered into foam. Some sailors clutched tiny charms, bronze sea gods, fragments of bone-knotted cords tied with secret knots. The act of swearing oaths was sacred. A crew might vow silence for safe passage, or swear not to eat a certain food like figs or pork until land was reached. One trireme's crew swore never to insult the sea while sober. That oath didn't last, but the laughter did. Some vessels carried shrines. These could be simple, a painted plank, or bundled herbs, or elaborate. One Athenian warship famously had a fishbone idol of Boreas, god of the north wind. The crew lit a tiny lamp before every voyage. When the lamp refused to stay lit, they canceled their journey entirely. Prayers weren't always spoken aloud. A sailor might press his palm to the mast before bed, or draw a spiral in the salt crust on the deck. Some carved prayers directly into their oars, believing it made each pull smoother. Others swore their dreams were answered through gull cries or wave shapes. Disagreements about which rituals worked were common. Some captains banned religious rites, fearing they stirred panic or invited bad luck. One log notes that incense caused 3 men to faint, and a 4th to start speaking in tongues, none of which improved rowing speed. Yet other ships thrived on ritual, assigning a prayer officer to lead chants during storms or over sick beds. These beliefs weren't always solemn. There was a ritual in Carthaginian crews, where a sailor shouted compliments to the stars before sleeping. Another tradition involved spitting wine into the wind while insulting past captains believed to ward off jealousy from the dead. Scholars remain divided on whether these acts were religious magical or just emotional ballast. Surviving artifacts, tiny altars, soot-stained charms, carved prayer staves, suggest they were a little of everything. Faith, routine, superstition, and fear formed a tangled rope. Yet whatever form they took, these moments mattered. They gave sailors something steady, something still. In a world of shifting tides and mysterious illnesses, the ability to speak to the sea, even if it never answered, felt like power. And when the candles flickered out, when only moonlight remained, even the most skeptical sailor sometimes placed his hand on the hull and mouthed a single word: safe. Not a prayer, not a spell, just a hope. A bowl of stew slides across the deck, intercepted mid-air, by a man who snarls at another crewman, then grins. There's a thud, a splash, and a muttered oath about garlic theft. You're witnessing a sea-born drama, petty, passionate, and entirely expected. Because rivalries among sailors weren't just common, they were practically recreational. Long days and close quarters bred tension. Some of it harmless, like racing to tie knots faster, or arguing whose fishing line caught more dinner. Others turned personal. One crew once argued for a full week over whose rowing chant had better rhythm. The captain finally resolved it by banning chanting altogether, which led to silent rowing and deeply theatrical sighs. Food theft was a major spark. Dried figs, olives, and spices were high-value items. Accusations flew like gulls during a squall. One sailor swore revenge over a stolen pinch of cumin. Another carved thief into his own bread crust and dared anyone to eat it. That loaf lasted 3 days, untouched, uneaten, legendary. Sleeping spots were another battleground. Sailors marked their territory with rope coils, carved initials, or the strategic placement of their least pleasant belongings. One Greek rower allegedly rubbed sardine oil on his favorite nap corner just to keep others away. No one contested the spot after that. Fights when they happened were short. Slaps, shouts, a flung sandal. Then laughter or a forced apology served cold with lentils. But not all rivalries ended so peacefully. One feud escalated through 3 ports, involving secret notes, stolen boots, and a false love letter addressed to the most beautiful oarsman. The recipient never found the author, but did start wearing a flower behind his ear. Captains learned to manage these tensions with strange tools. Some staged fake contests, fastest mop, best impersonation of a storm, or quietest sneeze. Prizes were laughably small. Half an onion, a good seat at dinner, but the point wasn't reward. It was redirection. Researchers continue to debate how deep these rivalries ran. Some argue they were bonding rituals, ways to blow off steam without mutiny. Others suggest they reflected real class and culture divisions aboard mixed nationality crews. Evidence from letters, ship logs, and graffiti show both playful teasing and serious grudges. In truth, it likely varied. One ship's feud was another's entertainment. Sailors often invented nicknames for their rivals like Snailfoot, Olive Hog, or Captain's second least favorite. These labels stuck for entire voyages, even showing up on carved oars. Yet even the worst enemies knew when to drop the act. A sudden storm, a sick crewmate, or a near collision reminded everyone that survival came first. Rivalries paused. Jokes turned to cooperation, and afterward, a stolen spice jar might reappear quietly, respectfully, almost reverently. Because the sea was big, but the ship was small. And sooner or later, you needed the man who stole your lentils to help patch your sandal. A burst of laughter echoes from below deck, followed by the unmistakable squish of someone dancing in wet sandals. No one minds. Tonight, it's celebration of what no one's sure. But when you live surrounded by waves and rope burns, you don't need a reason. Just figs. Maybe a goat cheese if you're lucky. Ancient sailors found ways to celebrate even in the most unforgiving conditions. Birthdays were rare, but sacred, often marked with a shared fig cake, a dash of stolen spice, or a freshly scrubbed deck. If a crew member admitted the occasion, some didn't to avoid attention. Others would craft gifts, a seashell whistle, a knotted bracelet, or a story told loudly and inaccurately in their honor. The lanterns came out for special nights. Hung from the rigging or balanced in old helmets, they cast strange dancing shadows across the wood. Men twirled, limped, or did their best impressions of sea serpents in love. The floor creaked beneath their feet, occasionally betraying someone's rhythm with a sudden wobble. Laughter followed. Always. Once a quiet wedding was held aboard a merchant vessel, anchored near Cyprus. The bride wore a crown of pickled vine leaves. The groom's ring was braided seaweed, replaced every few days with a fresh one. Their vows were not written, but whispered, carried off by the breeze. A shipmate played a tune on a flute made from driftwood. They kissed the crew, cheered, and then someone dropped the cheese overboard. Feasts, though modest, were inventive. Pickled onions got fancy if served in a clean bowl. Fish was special if it came with lemon ash or 2 olives. On very rare occasions, a trader ship might bring exotic delicacies: dried mango cinnamon dust, a single precious fig soaked in wine. These were cut into slices thinner than paper and passed around like treasure. One crew carved a tiny theater from crates and staged a drama about an oar falling in love with a sail. Another crew celebrated the end of a long voyage by naming each rat on board and giving them honorary ranks. The admiral was the fattest. He died peacefully in a barrel of grain, a hero in his own right. Some celebrations honored the sea: a coin tossed into the water, a shout into the wind, a collective chant of gratitude loud enough to scare the gulls. Captains might allow one full day of rest: no rowing, no repairs, just cleaning hammocks and telling impossible stories about mermaids and sea chariots. Mental health wasn't a term ancient sailors knew, but instinctively they understood joy mattered. Celebrations weren't just indulgences, they were balm. They patched invisible wounds, soothed silent grief, and reminded the crew they were more than tired bodies on a damp plank. They were people, singing, laughing barefoot people who danced despite the mold. Researchers believe these rituals helped preserve morale. But even without scholarly validation, one truth remains: if you can laugh with someone while holding a fig in one hand and a leaky boot in the other, you'll probably survive anything. The port grows larger on the horizon. Ropes tighten, sails are drawn, and boots begin to thud with a different rhythm, heavier, expectant. The journey's ending is no longer an idea. It's a scent. Earthy, floral, metallic. The smell of home or something trying to be. But before you step ashore, the ship holds one final ritual reflection. Disembarking was more than climbing down a plank. It was stepping off a world that floated. Sailors returned, changed tanner leaner, more superstitious. They bore new scars, rope burns, fishhook cuts, and marks from beds that were never beds at all. Some limped. Others laughed louder than before. A few just stood at the edge of the dock, quietly staring at land as if unsure it would hold them. Many kissed the ground, lips pressed to stone, or dirt, not for drama, but to feel something still. Others stayed silent, pocketing pebbles, or muttering thanks to whatever gods hadn't drowned them. There was no uniform tradition, but always a weight in the chest. Not grief, not relief. Something slower, deeper. A quiet rebalancing. Some sailors brought back pets' cats with half-closed eyes, parrots with brand new curses, a monkey who had learned to drink vinegar and play dead for figs. Others brought stories, wild, wonderful, wildly inaccurate. Maps sketched on sailcloth showed islands that didn't exist, beasts that were probably just whales, with bad timing, and trade routes involving sunken temples made entirely of coral. Friends gathered at dockside inns to recount the voyage. Each tale shifted slightly with retelling. The storm became larger. The stew became worse. The ghost in the sail. That part was absolutely true depending on how much wine had been poured. There is ongoing debate among historians about how much sailors truly remembered versus what they embellished. Some argue that memory at sea was unreliable, distorted by hunger exhaustion and salt. Others claim these exaggerated tales served a purpose, transforming trauma into legend, fear into fable. Perhaps it didn't matter. The journey changed you, whether you remembered it clearly or not. The rope calluses stayed. So did the strange urge to whisper to seagulls or to chew bread extra slowly, savoring the absence of weevils. Some never sailed again. Others left After only a few days on land, drawn back to the chaos, the camaraderie, the wind that spoke in riddles, a few sent letters that never arrived. One man famously built a boat in his backyard and slept in it every night until the neighbors intervened. But most slipped back into land life, awkwardly unevenly, and with the quiet pride of those who'd shared breath with the sea. So, as the gangplank lowers and the hull groans one final time, you carry your bag, your scars, and your stories ashore. You leave behind salted wood and midnight chants, and you take with you the memory of floating, of belonging to something wild wet and oddly beautiful. Because even when the maps are wrong, the stew is cold, and the dreams make no sense, the ship always remembers. The lanterns have been doused, the ropes are coiled, and the sea for now has gone quiet. You're no longer aboard, just resting in its memory. The thrum of oars, the squawk of gulls, the soft creak of timbers, they drift now, like lullabies, echoing far behind your closed eyes. Somewhere in your dreams, a cat chases a beetle across the deck, and a parrot mumbles the captain's worst poem. Let yourself return to stillness. Breathe like waves. Curl into the softness of linen and night air. Whatever storms you face today, real or imagined, have passed. You've crossed ancient waters, shared ghost stories with monkeys, eaten lentils of questionable age, and laughed at nothing in particular. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?